Alaska is the largest state in America. It also has the highest rate of disappearances of any state in the country. Over 16,000 people have vanished into its wilderness since 1988 alone. Cases that broke families, paralyzed investigators, and have never been fully explained. Let's get into it. Sterling, Alaska, September 5th, 1978. Let me tell you something about Sterling, Alaska before I tell you what happened there. This is the Kenai Peninsula, a place 136 miles south of Anchorage where the wilderness presses in from every direction. The forests here are dense and old, the kind that absorbs sound. Roads run through the trees like tunnels. Cabins sit back from the highway on dirt tracks you can barely see from the road. It is beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they haven't been touched yet. And in 1978, it was the kind of community where people didn't lock their doors. Not because they were careless. Because there was no reason to. That was about to change. Scott Fandel was 13 years old. Brown hair, blue eyes, a prankster, the kind of kid who made everyone around him laugh and then looked innocent when they turned to find out who was responsible. But underneath the humor was something serious. Scott was fiercely protective of his little sister Amy. Watched over her the way older brothers do when they've decided that's their job and nobody is going to talk them out of it. He had passed a wilderness survival course. He loved motorcycles and the outdoors. He was, by everyone's description, a boy who knew how to handle himself. Amy was 8. Blonde hair, brown eyes. She loved dolls and pretty clothes and animals, and her mother Margaret described her as kind to everyone she met. She was the kind of little girl who believed the world was essentially good. She had no reason yet to believe otherwise. They lived with their mother in a 2-room cabin on Scout Lake Loop Road, south of Sterling. The cabin sat in a heavily wooded area, mostly hidden from the road. A single street light out front provided the only illumination after dark. And here's the detail that matters, the one that should have been fixed and wasn't. The cabin had no working lock on the door. Anyone could walk in. Anyone. Margaret and Roger Fandel had gone through a bitter divorce 9 months earlier. Roger had moved to Arizona. The family was rebuilding, Margaret, Scott, and Amy, and in early September, Margaret's sister Kathy had come to stay with them. There were plans to save money and eventually move back to Illinois. Things were precarious, but moving forward. On the evening of September 4th, 1978, the family went to Good Time Charlie's, a local bar and restaurant in Sterling. Scott and Amy played the arcade games while the women drank. Around 10 p.m., Margaret and Kathy dropped the children off at the cabin and drove to Kenai, about 11 miles away, to meet up with a friend. They told the kids they'd be back later. Scott and Amy walked next door to the Lupton house. The Lupton children were their closest friends, practically their family. They played together every day. They walked to school together every morning. The kids played at the Luptons for a while, until Nancy and Bill Lupton decided it was too late and sent the Fandel children home. A neighbor driving past the cabin at 11:45 p.m. noticed the lights were on inside. Margaret and Kathy came home between 1:30 and 3 a.m. The lights were off. Both children were afraid of the dark. They never turned the lights off voluntarily, but the women assumed the kids had simply gone to bed and didn't check on them. They went to sleep. In the morning, Kathy assumed Scott and Amy had already left for school. It was only in the afternoon, when the Lupton children came looking for them, they hadn't shown up to walk to school, hadn't shown up at school at all, that Margaret picked up the phone. She called the school. Neither child had been there. She called the police at 5:14 p.m. on September 5th. When troopers arrived at the cabin, here is what they found. A pot of water on the stove, still warm. An open can of tomatoes on the counter. A box of macaroni sitting next to it. Scott had been in the middle of making one of his favorite late-night snacks. The water was boiling, the macaroni was out, and then something interrupted him, something that made him stop mid-task and leave the stove on, the food out, and the cabin empty. Scott and Amy Fandel have never been seen again. Now let's apply logic to this scene because the details matter. Two children are taken from a cabin in the middle of the night, in the middle of a task, without leaving any evidence of a struggle, without making a sound loud enough to alert the neighbors who lived a short walk away. The Luptons heard nothing. A neighbor drove past at 11:45 and the lights were on, meaning everything was normal. Sometime between 11:45 p.m. and 1:30 a.m., whatever happened, happened. The cabin had no lock. That is the single most important architectural fact in this case. Whoever entered that cabin did not need to force anything, did not need to break a window or kick a door. They just turned the handle and walked in. Police brought search dogs from Anchorage. They combed the surrounding woods. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a single physical trace that Scott and Amy Fandel had walked out of that cabin. One detail surfaced that investigators noted but could never explain. Bullet casings found outside the cabin. Whether they had anything to do with what happened that night, nobody knows. There is one name that has circled this case for nearly 5 decades, Roger Fandel, Amy's biological father, Scott's stepfather. He had moved to Arizona 9 months before the children disappeared. When Margaret tried to reach him immediately after they went missing, she couldn't. His family said he didn't have the children, and then, a few days later, Roger flew to Alaska to help with the search. He was never charged. No evidence ever pointed definitively to him. But Amy's maternal uncle, Terry Schoenfelder, has maintained for decades that Roger took them. That something happened to Scott after the fact, that Amy may still be alive somewhere. Over the years, internet investigators found a woman on Facebook with the same name, interacting with a Roger Fandel account. The woman denied being Amy Fandel. The account eventually disappeared. A former Alaska state trooper who worked the case for years described the investigative experience as chasing quirks and spiderweb leads. Every thread that looked like it was going somewhere dissolved when you pulled on it. One former investigator said the most chilling detail of all was a simple one: those lights. Scott and Amy Fandel were afraid of the dark. In every account from people who knew them, in every memory their mother carried, they always left the lights on. Always. The lights were off when Margaret came home. Whoever left that cabin last, or whoever was the last one in it, turned the lights off on the way out. Children afraid of the dark don't do that. Scott Fandel would be in his late 50s today. Amy would be in her early 50s. They are listed as active missing persons cases with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Age-progressed photos show what they might look like now. A middle-aged man and woman who have been out in the world for nearly 50 years with no confirmed sighting. Somewhere on Scout Lake Loop Road, in a cabin that had no lock on its door, a 13-year-old boy was making macaroni when something came through that door. The pot was still warm when investigators arrived. The macaroni was never finished. Anchorage to Juneau, Alaska, October 16, 1972. I want you to understand what kind of search this was before I tell you. It found nothing. The U.S. Coast Guard was there, the Navy was there, the Army, the Air Force, the Civil Air Patrol, 40 military aircraft, 50 civilian planes, a search grid that covered 325,000 square miles, an area larger than the state of Texas. 3,600 hours of airborne search time over 39 days. It was, at that point, the largest search and rescue operation in American history. And at the end of 39 days, they called it off. They had found nothing. Not a fragment of wreckage, not a piece of luggage, not a body, not a single trace that 4 men and a small aircraft had ever existed. Let me tell you who was on that plane. Hale Boggs was 58 years old and one of the most powerful politicians in America. He represented Louisiana in the House of Representatives and served as House Majority Leader, the second most powerful position in the chamber, one step below the Speaker. He was the kind of man whose phone calls got returned immediately. He had been a member of the Warren Commission, the government body that investigated the assassination of President Kennedy. His daughter was Cokie Roberts, who would go on to become one of the most recognized journalists in American broadcasting. Hale Boggs was not a man who disappeared quietly. Nick Begich was 40, a freshman congressman from Alaska, fighting a tight re-election race against Republican State Senator Don Young. Boggs had agreed to help campaign for Begich in Alaska, a whirlwind 48-hour fundraising trip designed to shore up support before November. He was helping a younger colleague, a political favor. With them were Begich's aide, Russell Brown, and the pilot, Don Johns, a 38-year-old veteran aviator with over 17,000 hours of flight time. Johns was no amateur. He was the chief pilot for Pan-Alaska Airways, a man who had spent his career navigating Alaska's brutally unforgiving airspace. He filed a VFR flight plan for the twin-engine Cessna 310, tail number N1812H, taking off from Anchorage at 9 a.m. on October 16th, heading southeast to Juneau. The flight should have taken 3.5 hours. There was a detail about Don Johns that investigators would later note with particular discomfort. A few weeks before the flight, he had submitted an article to Flying magazine. The article was titled, "Ice Without Fear." It was about flying through icing conditions, the same conditions he would encounter that October morning over the mountains and waterways of southern Alaska. The plane left Anchorage. It was never seen again. At noon on October 17th, Thomas Tip O'Neill of Massachusetts stood in the well of the House of Representatives and addressed his colleagues. "It is our hope and prayer," he said, his voice steady, "that the men will be found safe." The chamber went quiet in a way that chambers rarely do. For 39 days, the most extensive search operation America had ever mounted tried to find them. The weather that day had not been catastrophically bad. There were clouds and some icing conditions, but not the kind of weather that would normally ground an experienced pilot. Investigators believe the most likely route took them through Portage Pass over Prince William Sound toward the coast, and that at some point, somewhere over that vast cold water, something went wrong. Ice on the wings, a mechanical failure, an error in judgment made at 10,000 feet above an ocean that does not give back what it takes. But here is where the official story ends and the questions begin. Hale Boggs had made powerful enemies. He was one of the loudest congressional critics of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, at a time when criticizing Hoover was considered close to political suicide. He had accused Hoover's agency of tapping the phones of members of Congress. He had called publicly for Hoover's resignation, and Hoover, who had spent 48 years building a surveillance apparatus that reached into every corner of American power, was not the kind of man who forgave that kind of public attack. And then there is the mafia theory. It is specific enough to be unsettling. In 1994, a man named Jerry Max Pasley was in prison in Arizona for murder. He had a confession to make. Pasley had connections to the Bonanno crime family. He admitted to multiple bombings and killings on behalf of organized crime. But the most startling thing he told investigators was this. In 1972, he had been handed a locked briefcase by a Bonanno lieutenant and instructed to transport it to Anchorage and hand it to two men. He flew back to Arizona the next day. He was told something big was about to happen. Weeks later, the plane carrying Nick Begich and Hale Boggs disappeared. Here is the detail that makes Pasley's account impossible to simply dismiss. Peggy Begich, the widow of Congressman Nick Begich, remarried less than 17 months after her husband's disappearance. The man she married was Jerry Max Pasley. She married the man who later claimed to have transported the bomb that may have killed her first husband. That marriage lasted 2 years. It ended in divorce. And the investigation into Pasley's claims never produced enough evidence to formally connect the briefcase to the crash. Here's what we know for certain. The pilot of that Cessna left his emergency locator transmitter, the device that broadcasts a distress signal in a crash, not on the aircraft, but in a plane at the Fairbanks airport. The ELT that could have led searchers directly to the wreckage was sitting in a completely different aircraft hundreds of miles away. Whether that was an oversight, negligence, or something deliberate, nobody has ever established. The wreckage of N1812H has never been found. The bodies of Hale Boggs, Nick Begich, Russell Brown, and Don Johns have never been recovered. In November 1972, both Boggs and Begich were re-elected to Congress, posthumously, while the search was still active because their names were still on the ballot. The seats were later vacated by congressional resolution and filled by special elections. Hale Boggs' wife Lindy replaced him in Congress and served 8 more terms. Nick Begich's seat was won by Don Young, the man Begich had been flying to Juneau to campaign against. Young held that seat until his own death in 2022. The search was called off on November 24, 1972. A telegram from President Richard Nixon, sent in the final minutes of the day, officially ended it. And somewhere in the cold, deep water of Prince William Sound, or beneath the glaciers of the Harding ice field, 4 men have been waiting more than 50 years to be found. The largest search in American history. Not one piece of wreckage. The man who was supposed to carry the emergency beacon left it behind. The House Majority Leader's harshest enemy ran the most powerful intelligence agency in the country. The widow of one passenger married a man who later confessed to transporting a bomb to Alaska in 1972. Maybe it was ice, maybe it was weather, maybe it was nothing more than a small plane, a difficult route, and the Alaska wilderness doing what it has always done to everyone who underestimates it. Or maybe it was something else entirely, and if it was, the proof is at the bottom of an ocean that has been keeping secrets for half a century. If you like these unexplained stories, hit that subscribe button and support the channel. Let me know what you think in the comments. Nome, Alaska, 1960 to 2005. Picture a town at the end of the world, not as a metaphor, as a geographic fact. Nome, Alaska sits on the southern shore of the Seward Peninsula on the edge of the Bering Sea, 539 miles west of Anchorage. There are no roads connecting it to the rest of Alaska, no highways running in or out. The only way to reach Nome is by plane or, in the brief summer months, by barge. Once winter comes, and winter in Nome comes hard, with temperatures plunging to 50 below zero and darkness that consumes the sky for months, you are not leaving unless someone flies you out. You are there, inside the walls of winter, inside the walls of that town. Nome has a few thousand residents, a harbor, a university satellite campus, some well-known chain businesses, and a main street called Front Street that is lined with bars. In a region where most communities are legally dry, where alcohol is restricted or prohibited because its consequences in extreme cold and extreme isolation are well documented and catastrophic, Nome has always had a different relationship with drinking. People came from surrounding villages to Nome specifically because Nome had bars. They would drink, and sometimes they would go out into the night, and sometimes they wouldn't come back. This happened more times than it should have, and for a long time, nobody with real power paid attention. Between 1960 and the early 2000s, 24 people vanished in and around Nome. 24. In a town of a few thousand people. Men and women, most of them Alaska Native, most of them last seen leaving bars or walking home along the dark, icy streets of Front Street. Searches were conducted. Some bodies were found in the river or the sea, others were never found at all. The community's tribal leadership began sounding alarms in the mid-1990s. A tribal council member from a nearby village formally requested a federal investigation in 1998. Nobody came. Let me say that clearly. A community of Alaska Natives told federal authorities that their people were disappearing at an alarming rate and had been for decades. They asked for help. For 7 years, they were ignored. Here's what finally broke it open. A Nome police officer was accused of killing a Native American woman. When that case became public, tribal leaders, who had been trying to get someone to listen for years, finally had the attention of the media and the press. And the press started asking questions about all the other names that had gone unaccounted for. How many? More than 24. Over how long? Decades. By the summer of 2005, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit from Quantico, Virginia, finally arrived in Nome. The U.S. Attorney for Alaska, Tim Burgess, stood in front of reporters and said something that the community had been saying for years. A concern expressed by the community is that there's very clearly some pattern to these disappearances, and there might be a serial killer. The FBI interviewed everyone. They pulled files. They built timelines. They worked the case with the full weight of federal investigative resources that the community had been requesting for 7 years. Their conclusion? Alcohol and the environment. They determined that most of the disappearances were attributable to intoxication and exposure to the extreme cold, that people left bars drunk, wandered into the tundra or toward the water, and succumbed to a landscape that does not forgive a wrong step in February at -30 degrees. The FBI found no evidence of a serial killer, no evidence of organized foul play. Case effectively closed. But here is what the FBI's conclusion does not explain. A 24-year-old woman named Sonia Ivanov was among those who had vanished. Her case was initially filed alongside the others, assumed to be another tragic alcohol and exposure story. It was not. In 2007, a former Nome police officer named Matthew Owens confessed to murdering her. He said he acted alone and had no knowledge of the other cases. Think about what that means. At least one of the 24 was murdered. Definitively, by a police officer, a man with a badge and authority in the same community where people had been disappearing for decades, and his conviction was held up briefly as proof that the cluster had been explained, as if one identified perpetrator resolved 24 open files. Internal FBI documents reviewed years later revealed that investigators never actually believed Owens's confession resolved the larger pattern. They continued to consider other cases unsettled, but publicly, the investigation was wound down. The families had their answer. The system had done its job. Except the families didn't have their answers. They had one answer for one victim, decades after the first names went onto that list. Let me tell you what makes this case sit differently from a pure wilderness tragedy. Between September 2005 and June 2006 alone, a 10-month window, at least 9 people disappeared in or near Nome. 9 people in 10 months in a town of a few thousand. Among them, a college student visiting family. 2 Nome police dispatchers who vanished on separate nights while walking home. A prominent local physician who was last seen leaving the hospital after his shift. A physician walking home from work, gone. That is not a pattern of drunk people wandering into the tundra. That is a pattern of people from every demographic, every walk of life, every level of sobriety, vanishing from the same geographic corridor over the same short window of time. The FBI's explanation may account for some of the 24. It may even account for most of them. Alaska is brutal and unforgiving in ways that people who have never been there simply cannot fully process. The cold is not weather. It is a condition. It rewrites the rules of survival in ways that can overwhelm even careful, prepared people in minutes. But it doesn't account for all of them. And the 7 years that elapsed between when the community first asked for help and when the FBI finally arrived, 7 years during which people continued to disappear, during which the pattern continued to build, during which the indigenous community's pleas were treated as background noise. That institutional failure is not erased by a conclusion that placed all the blame on the victims and the climate. 24 names, most of them Alaska native, most of them gone without a confirmed explanation. And the system that was supposed to protect them needed 7 years, a police officer accused of murder, and national media attention to finally show up. The Bering Sea is right there, cold and dark and indifferent. It gives back very little of what it takes. And Nome is still Nome, still at the end of the road that doesn't exist, still surrounded by miles of tundra in every direction, still a place where the winter night lasts for months, and the wrong step at the wrong moment can mean everything. Anchorage, Alaska, 1972 to 1983. Let me tell you what kind of man Robert Hansen appeared to be, because the contrast is the case. He was a baker. He ran a small shop in downtown Anchorage, and the cops used to stop in for coffee and donuts on their morning rounds. He was quiet, mousy, a thin man with a stutter that he'd carried since childhood, the kind of speech impediment that had made his adolescence miserable and turned him inward. He was married with 2 children. He held hunting records in Alaska, which in a state full of serious hunters means something. He was, by all surface accounts, the unremarkable, hard-working, forgettable backbone of his community. He was also, between 1972 and 1983, abducting women in Anchorage, flying them in his private plane to remote stretches of the Alaskan wilderness, releasing them and hunting them. When Robert Hansen was finally caught in 1983 and confronted with the evidence against him, he confessed to 17 murders. Investigators called him the Butcher Baker. He was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in 2014 at the age of 75 in an Anchorage correctional facility. But here's the part of this case that doesn't end with his sentencing. Here is the part that is still open. When Alaska state troopers obtained a search warrant for Hansen's home, they found something extraordinary hidden inside his bedroom. In the headboard of his bed, tucked away where his wife apparently never found it, was a map of the Alaskan wilderness, and on that map were dozens of X marks. Each X was a location. Each location was a grave. Hansen was confronted with the map. He confirmed what investigators suspected. He walked them through it. He showed them where 17 women were buried, scattered across the remote backcountry of south-central Alaska. 12 of those locations were sites investigators had never known about. The searches that followed recovered remains and returned them to families who had spent years not knowing what had happened to the people they loved. But there were marks on that map that Hansen refused to explain. 3 of them. 3 X marks in Resurrection Bay, near the coastal town of Seward, that Hansen would not discuss. He would not name the victims. He would not give locations more specific than the region. He would not help investigators understand what those marks meant. Investigators believe 2 of those marks are the graves of women they have named as possible victims. Mary Thill, a young woman who disappeared from Soldotna in 1975, and Megan Emmerich. Hansen denied killing them. The graves have never been found. And then there is Eklutna Annie. In the late 1970s, construction workers near Eklutna Road in Anchorage discovered a woman's body. She had been murdered. Her killer's method matched Robert Hansen's known pattern. She was young, female, almost certainly one of his victims. Investigators were certain enough to believe it, but she had no identification. No one came forward to claim her. No missing person report matched her description. She was called Eklutna Annie, named for the road where she was found, and she has never been identified. She exists in the case files as a victim without a name, a person without a history, a woman whose family has spent nearly 50 years not knowing that she is dead or who she was. Let's talk about how Hansen operated for over a decade without being caught. Because that is not just a story about one man. That is a story about what a system is willing to see and what it decides not to see. Hansen's victims were primarily sex workers and women working in the adult entertainment industry in Anchorage during the pipeline boom of the mid-1970s. The construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline brought a flood of workers and money into Anchorage, and with it came a vice economy. Strip clubs, prostitution, drugs. Women from outside Alaska came to work in it, hoping to make money during the boom. They were strangers in a new city with no community roots, no established networks, no one who would notice immediately if they stopped showing up. When these women started disappearing, investigators noticed. Eventually. But the notices were slow to come and slower to be treated with urgency because missing sex workers in a boomtown can disappear for a dozen different reasons that have nothing to do with murder. They can move on, they can go home, they can just leave. This is the logic that let Robert Hansen operate for more than a decade, not the wilderness, not his plane. The institutional decision, never formalized, never stated openly, but present in the pace of the investigation, that the women who were going missing were the kind of women who go missing on their own, and that there was probably nothing sinister worth looking for. It was a woman who survived. In 1983, Cindy Paulson escaped from Hansen's truck while he had her handcuffed and tried to get police to believe her. She was a sex worker. The officers she went to initially dismissed her account. They called Hansen, a respected local businessman with a stutter and a bakery, and accepted his denial. She had to fight to be believed. It was only when Alaska State Trooper Glenn Floth took her story seriously and dug into Hansen's background that everything unraveled. The map in the headboard, the jewelry from victims hidden in a crawl space, the rifle that matched ballistics from multiple crime scenes, and 3 X marks in Resurrection Bay that Hansen took to his grave without explaining. Here's what haunts me about this case. The women whose remains were found on that map, their families got answers. Terrible, devastating answers, but answers. They got something to bury. They got a location they could point to and say, that is where she is. The women under those 3 unexplained X marks don't have that. Their families, if they're still out there, if they ever knew these women were missing, have been living in the same uncertainty for 50 years. Waiting for a name, a location, a phone call that never came. Eklutna Annie is still unidentified. She is buried in an Anchorage cemetery under a marker that carries a name that wasn't hers. Somewhere she has a real name. Somewhere she had a family. Somewhere, if she were identified today through modern DNA genealogy techniques, someone would get a phone call that would destroy and also close something that has been open for half a century. Robert Hansen knew exactly who she was. He took that knowledge with him when he died in 2014. The 3 X marks on the map. The name Eklutna Annie never had. All of it closed behind a prison door and then a coffin lid. The bakery is gone. The headboard is in an evidence locker. The map is still there, with its marks, including the 3 that were never explained. And the wilderness of Resurrection Bay is keeping its secrets exactly as well as Hansen knew it would when he first flew out there decades ago. Anchorage, Alaska, 2012. On February 1st, 2012, a surveillance camera outside a coffee stand on Tudor Road in Anchorage captured something that seemed, at first glance, completely unremarkable. A man approached the window. He was 34 years old, medium build, unremarkable appearance, the kind of face that you pass on the street 100 times and never retain. He ordered a drink. He paid. And then, in a moment that the camera captured, but the barista did not survive to describe, he abducted 18-year-old Samantha Koenig at gunpoint and walked her to his white pickup truck parked across the street. Samantha Koenig was murdered that night. Her body was hidden in a shed, and the man who killed her drove across the country, 4,000 miles to Texas, where unusual activity on Samantha's ATM card led investigators to him. His name was Israel Keys. He was a construction worker who had lived in Anchorage since 2007. His neighbors described him as quiet and hard-working. One of his neighbors was an assistant U.S. attorney who had hired him as a handyman, gave him a key to her house. When Keys was arrested and investigators began to understand what they were dealing with, the case split open into something that has never fully closed. Israel Keys confessed, not just to Samantha Koenig's murder, to everything. He sat across from FBI agents in an Anchorage jail cell for months and told them, in a voice that remained calm and almost clinical throughout, that he had been killing people for over a decade. He told them about a couple in Vermont named Bill and Lorraine Currier, whom he had murdered in 2011. He told them about murder kits, caches of weapons, cash, and supplies that he had buried in locations across the country years in advance, returning to use them when the timing was right. He told them about flying from Alaska to Chicago, renting a car, and driving 1,000 miles to Vermont specifically to kill strangers he had never met, strangers he chose at random because the geographic distance from Alaska made him virtually impossible to connect to the crime. He was meticulous, methodical, patient in a way that most people find it difficult to process. He did not stalk specific victims. He chose them the way a driver chooses an exit ramp, based on opportunity and timing, not on who they were. Your identity was irrelevant. Your life was irrelevant. All that mattered was whether the conditions were right. Over the course of his interviews, Keyes told investigators he believed there were 11 victims total. The FBI confirmed 4, which means there are 7 more people, 7 real people with families and lives and names, whose deaths have never been connected to the man who caused them. Here's the thing about Israel Keyes that makes his case uniquely, permanently disturbing. He talked. He sat in that jail cell and he talked for months. He provided details about his crimes that were verified, locations that checked out, methods that matched known evidence. He was not trying to mislead investigators. He was, in his own way, cooperating. He wanted the record to be complete, but he would not give names. He would not identify his other victims. He dropped hints. He referenced locations. He made comments that investigators have been parsing for years, trying to map onto unsolved disappearances and cold cases across the country. He traveled extensively, Alaska to the Pacific Northwest, across the Midwest into the Northeast, through Canada. There are missing persons cases in all of those regions that fit his timeline, his method, his profile. Cases where a person disappeared without struggle, without witnesses, without the kind of evidence that a conventional killer leaves behind. Because Keyes had spent years studying how investigations work, he knew what to leave and what to take. He knew where the cameras were and where they weren't. And then on December 2nd, 2012, in his jail cell in Anchorage, Israel Keyes killed himself. He died before he could be tried, before he could be forced to answer, in a courtroom, for any of it. Before the families of 7 unnamed victims could look at him across a room and demand to know who their person was. He left behind writings on yellow legal pad paper found beneath his body. The FBI sent them to the laboratory in Virginia. They were analyzed for hidden messages, codes, secondary meaning. The conclusion was that there were none. The writings were what they appeared to be, the private thoughts of a man who had decided to end things on his own terms, the way he had conducted every other significant act in his life, deliberately, completely, and in a way that left the people around him with nothing they could use. 7 people. That is the FBI's estimate. 7 individuals whose deaths have never been attributed, whose families have never been told, whose cases may be sitting in cold case files in 6 different states, right now labeled as unexplained disappearances or unsolved homicides. 7 names that Israel Keyes knew and chose to carry out of this world. Here's what the FBI has done since his death. They released extensive video recordings of his interviews. They published an interactive timeline of his known movements going back to 1997. They created a map. They asked the public to look at it, to compare the dates and locations to people they knew who went missing, to call a tip line. The tip line is still active. Because somewhere, in the overlap between Keyes' documented travels and the cases that remain open, there are families who deserve to know. Families who have been waiting for a call that doesn't come because the man who could make it decided in an Anchorage jail cell in December 2012 that they didn't get to have one. He was meticulous right up to the end. Even his suicide was deliberate. Even his silence was chosen. He gave investigators enough to confirm he was a monster, and not quite enough to close the files he left open. And somewhere across the country, 7 sets of remains are waiting in locations that only one man ever knew, in a wilderness that keeps secrets exactly as well as he calculated it would. If you made it to the end, hit that like button and subscribe right now. More cases like these are coming. Drop in the comments which case disturbed you most. because every one of these sits differently, and I have a feeling we don't all land in the same place.